Let me kind of set the stage for why I think this conversation today in your article is very, very timely. One of the things that was discussed yesterday, that President Trump, when he was in one of his press gaggles, was asked, what is it about this issue that you're trying to help the Ukraine side? Where is that going?
The ability of Ukraine to reach deep inside of Russia and conduct strikes. I think that's one of the dynamics that's changed in this war over the last few months, and that is that Russians are finding it more difficult to defend their own airspace. And what we hope that means is that it's going to create the space now to negotiate the end of this war.
It's an escalation, but it's also an escalation that can help lead to an end.
Okay, so, I mean, you heard President Trump himself said it right there at the end of that. While Marco Rubio's talking, and I was going to just ask you about that, because the prospect that by having all these strikes deep inside of Russia, that's going to cause Russia to change its terms and say, okay, I tell you, we'll settle for something less. I do want to hear your view on that. But that last part there, Trump said it's an escalation. His words. That is something that's happening here. And there's many on the Russian side that are not very keen to be pressured like that. And they're thinking, yeah, if you want to escalate, how's about we escalate on your head? So what is your concern that how that's being received on the Russian side? So we'll look at the first two areas. First of all, Marco Rubio's, is that pressure with these strikes that are on Omsk, Belgorod, all these different kinds of places on the Russian side, and these some of their St. Petersburg into Moscow, et cetera. Is all that going to put enough pressure to finally cause Russia to go, okay, we'll settle for less than those June 2024 terms?
Yeah. It's a fascinating conversation, Danny. The Rubio and by Trump have both made a fundamental error of judgment, and it's an error which I talk about almost immediately in the article, Danny, because what I talk about in the article is I start off with a quote. I won't quote it in full, but it's by war's greatest philosopher, General Karl von Clausewitz, who says essentially that the key judgment that any military man or politician must make before entering into war is to understand its nature. And what we've heard from Rubio is that he doesn't understand his nature. What do I mean? What I mean is that Russia is actually fighting this war for defensive purposes, whereas as far as I can see, Rubio and by default Trump are assuming that this is a war about negotiation. It's a war about going up on escalation ladders so that they can bring Russia back to the negotiating table and get an end to the war. It's a fundamental misunderstanding of the war. And that is something which Clausewitz warned us against all those many years ago. I mean, I'd say many years ago. This was in the 1830s. I think his works were finally published on war. But that fundamental misunderstanding is a bit like a doctor having a really fundamental misdiagnosis of the patient. So what we're trying to do, or what they're trying to do, is assume that by increasing pressure on Russia, that they actually will change the terms of the negotiation. Whereas as far as Russia is concerned, this is a war, an existential war for Russia's survival. And a good reason to think that it might be for Russia's survival, because you've got people like Kalikalis, the foreign policy chief of the European Union, arguing that Russia should actually be broken up. And what are the Russians to think? And that's the context which I set out in the article, Danny. And I then make the next assumption, which is that the idea that Putin and Russia will wait until 2030, until the West have properly rearmed before responding, is a fantasy. I think, let's take those things in sequence here. President Trump and Rubio think that this is just a pressure campaign. It's just a pressure. As long as I put enough pressure on you, you're going to do what I want because that's what I want. But there are those who have been very vocal on the Russian side to clearly communicate that's not how it works in Moscow, nor would that be how it's going to work if it was UK or if it was America that was on the receiving end. We never react that way. I don't know why we somehow think that the other side will, other than it would be easy if they did. But what they have been saying is, if you keep up this pressure campaign and if you keep up this escalation, as President Trump calls it,
then how about we step up our own pressure campaign and launch strikes against the West here? So we've been talking about that a lot on the channel to a number of people, and there's a lot of concern that they're going to do that at some point if we maintain this pressure. But none of us have really addressed yet what that's going to mean. And I want to go to your article here. This is If the Coming War with Russia, a European Road to Ruin. It's a pretty scary picture on its own right there. But I just want to read the summary here because I think it's really important. And this is why I'd like you to go into some detail. NATO, EU, and E3 leaders are taking Europe down a path to be ready for war by 2030. In light of the European bellicosity, Russia could decide to start this sooner. If so, the U.S. would be unwilling to fight Russia on Europe's behalf. That's a pretty bold declaration there. Many people don't accept that. They think, no, Article 5 will draw the U.S. in. More on that in a minute. Unable to defend itself against Russia's conventional ballistic hypersonic missiles, Europe would suffer a rapid defeat. That is the first real big headline there. And a very high military losses. Even after suing for peace, destruction of Europe's energy system would plunge Europe into an economic crisis on top of a military loss. Europeans should be invited publicly to debate these risks and have their views heard. So let's start off right there. Why do you just say as a categorical thing that the U.S. would not intervene to fight Russia on Europe's behalf? And then second, that Europe would suffer a rapid defeat. What leads you to those conclusions?
Well, let's take the first of those first, Danny, and I'd be equally interested in your views. I mean, the scenario that I paint would emphasize that it's a scenario, not a forecast. So it's a scenario which allows us to think about things, and there may be other scenarios which are equally plausible, but for me it is plausible. What I assume is that Russia decides to act in September of this year, and that they act by actually taking out, possibly after warning, I don't know, the production facilities for long-range missiles in France, Germany, and Britain. And I assume that they make that attack. And I then raise the question, so what for NATO? Because, of course, Article 5 is not what people think. It doesn't require all of the members to actually come in behind. It requires members to do what actions they deem necessary. And so the question for the NATO members who are less inclined to this, such as Hungary and Spain and others, is what are we going to do now? Are we going to respond to a Russian attack and invite our attacks on our own countries? I think that's also an open question, because the big issue is how would the United States respond? Is the United States prepared to send more forces to Europe to be prepared to fight and die for a European conflict? And my guess, Danny, and I'd be interested to hear what you think, is that the United States won't. I think the United States at that moment will say, actually, this isn't exactly what we had expected. We had expected that the escalation ladder would be something that we could control, and it's clear that we can't. What we don't want to do is to get into any sort of confrontation with the owner of the world's greatest nuclear weapons stockpile. So what I then assume is that the E3 nevertheless think, well, we'd better respond. But when they respond, they get pretty much wiped out, because the only way that they can respond, Danny, plausibly, is with air operations. And they're going against air operations against one of the most tried and tested air defense systems in the world, because it's had 4 years of testing. So I assume that actually the missiles do achieve some effect in Russia, but limited effect in Russia. And the second thing that I assume is that the losses sustained by the Western aircraft are such that they decide not to do it again. But whilst they're thinking about that, I then assume that the Russians decide to go take the gloves off and actually do and I think they would probably do this just to Britain, France, and Germany, do to Britain, France, and Germany what they've been doing to Ukraine, which is surgically targeting their infrastructure. And the critical thing about this, Danny, is that we have no defense against this. We have probably limited defense, very, very limited defense against the ballistic missiles, and none whatsoever against the hypersonic missiles. So, of course, that then puts Britain and France in a difficult situation, because at that moment they're saying, well, the only way that we can actually do any more is to use nuclear weapons. Open question, am I going to sacrifice my nation? Because that's what that would mean, because, of course, again, you're up against the world's greatest nuclear weapons power. And I suspect that they would actually demur and say, you know what, probably we don't want to do this. So I think that then leads to them probably under American pressure to sue for peace.
But well, let's take a look at some of that, because you asked me a second ago what I thought, and I in entering the American side of this, that's also going to open the door to understanding each of the 32 members of NATO and how they will interpret this. Now, there is a common understanding, obliviously by many in the West, because they want to, that they just say Article 5 is an automatic, everybody's in war. That attack on one is an attack on all. I'm going to show you the actual text here. Yeah. This is from the official NATO treaty. Article 5 right here. The parties agree that an armed attack against one or more of them in Europe and North America shall be considered an attack against them all. Okay, then that phrase is true enough. It's there. That is accurate. But now we get into the difficult part, and I'm going to look at this from an American perspective, in such that if this armed attack occurs, each one of them in exercise of the right of individual or collective self-defense recognized by Article 51 of the UN Charter, will assist the parties attacked by taking forthwith individual and in concert with such parties, and this is the key part right here, such action as it deems necessary, including the use of armed forces, to restore and maintain security in the North Atlantic area. So there is no automatic fire. It's only that you will take such action as you deem necessary, which could include U.S. force, but armed force, but doesn't require it. It continues on. Any such armed attack and all measures taken as a result therein shall immediately be reported to the Security Council. And then it continues on later on. Now, people are not aware. This is nothing I want to point out. In the United States, when the Washington Treaty, as this was called at the time, when it was being debated, it was fiercely debated because there were many, because of the very fresh experiences of World War II, that we did not want to get into a case to where it's an automatic, we're back into war no matter what happens. So they ensured that in our version of the treaty in the U.S. Law, and this was also reflected in that even Article 5, is that if Article 5 is initiated, the U.S. Congress will meet, and then they will decide what they're going to do. Yes, we'll consider an attack on us, but if, in this case right here, let's just say that the first of your targets there, it's Germany and Italy, we'll say, because they are providing a lot of military assistance. Let's say that Russia hits those, and I don't remember your scenario, which one it was, but we'll say that those, if we consider that an attack on us, but we haven't been attacked and we're not going to receive ballistic missiles on American territory, our support may be in the terms of, we'll give you some more air defense missiles. We'll give you some more money. We'll do whatever. We're not going to send our forces there because we haven't been attacked. And our Congress and every single member, parliament, or their own governments have to do the exact same thing. And I can't imagine that there's going to be a whole lot of other countries that are going to line up to say, yes, put me in the crosshairs if you attack Germany and Italy or even UK. Put us in the crosshairs. We'll go ahead and take some missiles in the teeth too. How do you read that from the European side?
I read it exactly the way that you read it, Danny. And you and I had been here before and at different times because we were both in Afghanistan. And, you know, decision-making in Afghanistan, and certainly some countries in Afghanistan, really, I mean, you know, you had to take all the decisions back to the country itself. And some really struggled. You know, I feel sorry for the Canadians who really got a pasting in Kandahar and eventually left. And other countries really struggled as well. I remember Germany seemed to struggle to me. So, you know, you're going to have to take those. It's not just coming back to the United States, although that's crucial. It's crucial with the view on the United States, but you've got to go back to a number of other nations. And from what we've heard on this Ramstein conference, reading between the lines, yeah, that the idea that there is absolute unity on what to do about Russia is obviously not true. So it's at the stage where you actually have to commit, you know, blood and money. That actually, I think, is going to make a lot of parliaments think very, 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 you know, have long conversation. And I would be very surprised if there is a completely unified view in NATO, and I'd be very unsurprised if it's anything but. And we start to see a very different atmospheric within NATO. again, of course, what the problem here is that our politicians, I think, Danny, and I think it's less so the military people, but it's our politicians who are making the assumption that they can hide behind Article 5. And even if everybody, I mean, the truth is that even if everybody hid behind Article 5 and decided that they were going to oppose Russia, we are in a very, very difficult military situation because we cannot defend ourselves against the hypersonic missiles. And as Ted Postel in a recent podcast that you did with him demonstrated beyond all doubt, we've got very, very limited capabilities against ballistic missiles. So essentially, we're setting ourselves up for a reprisal about which we can do nothing, which is why the key issue in the article to me is that we must have a public debate about this, because we're being led towards the potential for war. And nobody amongst our leaders seems to be doing the risk analysis. And
in the spirit of that, educating people, I want to go back to your article here, because I think there's something else you have in here that is worthy of public talking, because you put here number 3, you put the strategic context. To begin, we must understand how we got here. It's clear to anyone familiar with the strategic history that the roots of this crisis run back to 1989. Now, you might get some people who would say, okay, maybe 2014. That's really going someplace. Most people would say, no, this is February 2022. But you say 1918. Can you explain why?
Yeah, it goes all the way back to the warnings at the end of the Cold War, when the Cold War finished, and the warnings from the great strategic thinkers of our time, Danny, such as George Keenan's the most obvious one, but there's Jack Matlock in there, there's Kissinger in there, there's Bill Burns in 2006, I think, with his net means net diplomatic telegram, and not least but last is John Mearsheimer, who, of course, before 2014 warned just what would happen. The point about these warnings as well, Danny, is that unlike all the conventional people who've been talking about this, they were prescient. That they forecast what would happen, and it's happened. So please, can we not listen to them? Because actually, surely, if their analysis was right this time and all the conventional thinking was wrong, they're worth listening to. So I think that's the context. But the problem is that if you see if you see the war as starting in February 2022, it's a bit like going to your doctor, and the doctor looks at you and says, "Okay, I know what's wrong with you. You don't need to talk to me. I know what's wrong with you, and here's the treatment." As opposed to saying, "Tell me about this. Tell me about this. Your symptoms. Tell me about the injuries." We've got to go back and really understand the proper context. Because if we don't do that, then you don't take any account whatsoever of General von Clausewitz. I'm a huge fan of Clausewitz. He is one of the great military thinkers. And yet everybody amongst our leaders, and it seems to me amongst quite a few of our military brethren as well, seems to